Welcome to Creepy Corner Stories, where the darkness whispers and the shadows come alive. Tonight, we're diving into a chilling theme that many know too well: night shift horror stories. So, dim the lights, settle in, and prepare for a journey into the spine-tingling world of night shift horrors. So, let's begin. Story: The Third Floor. I worked the night shift at a small hospital, tucked away in a quiet corner of town. It wasn't the kind of place you'd hear about in ghost stories. At least, that's what I thought when I started there. But the third floor? That was different. It had been closed off years ago, long before I was hired. Rumor had it that it used to be the psychiatric ward, but after a series of incidents, the hospital quietly shut it down. Nobody talked about it openly, but everyone had a story. My first encounter with the third floor happened 6 months into my job. I was working a double shift, exhausted but determined to finish my rounds. The halls were quiet, except for the occasional beep of a heart monitor or the shuffle of a nurse's shoes. I was charting some notes when the elevator dinged behind me. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly 3 a.m. I didn't expect anyone, so I turned around to see who it was. The elevator doors slid open, but no one stepped out. That's strange, I thought, brushing it off as a glitch. But then I noticed the button panel inside the elevator. The light for the third floor was glowing. A chill ran down my spine. No one had been up there for years, not since they locked it down. I leaned into the elevator, my finger hovering over the buttons, ready to send it back down. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of laughter, high-pitched and echoing, coming from the empty floor above. I froze. It wasn't the kind of laughter you'd hear in a moment of joy. It was wrong, distorted, and far too loud for an abandoned floor. Shaking it off, I pressed the closed door button and sent the elevator back to the lobby. But as the doors slid shut, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something or someone was watching me. I didn't tell anyone about the incident, not at first. But over the next few weeks, things got worse. Lights in the hallways would flicker whenever I walked past. The security cameras on the third floor started recording movement, even though the doors were locked and the area was supposed to be empty. One night, I was tasked with delivering some equipment to the maintenance room near the elevator. As I approached, I heard footsteps coming from the stairs. They were slow and deliberate, echoing down the empty stairwell. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I inched closer, peering into the darkened stairwell. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and a door slammed shut somewhere above me. I bolted back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding. The final straw came a few nights later. I was alone in the break room, trying to catch a moment of peace. The TV was on, playing some late-night infomercial, when the screen flickered and went black. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the static kicked in, loud and jarring. I grabbed the remote, but the buttons wouldn't work. The static grew louder, and within the noise, I could hear faint whispers. "Help me!" I dropped the remote, my eyes glued to the screen. The static began to shift, forming a blurry image of what looked like a hospital bed. In the background, a figure stood motionless, its face hidden in the shadows. And then, just as quickly as it started, the screen went dark. I quit the next morning. I didn't care about my notice or the pay. Whatever was on the third floor could stay there. I wasn't going to stick around to find out more. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in that hospital. But sometimes late at night, I dream about the third floor, and in those dreams, I always hear that same distorted laughter. Story: The Man in the Window. I used to work as a security guard at an office building downtown. The building wasn't huge, only 5 floors, but at night it felt endless. The quiet halls, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the long shadows cast by empty desks made it a little unnerving. But I never thought much of it. That changed during one particular shift. It was a Friday night, and the office was completely empty. My job was simple: patrol each floor every couple of hours, check the doors, and make sure everything was secure. Most nights were uneventful, and I'd pass the time watching videos on my phone or reading a book. That night, however, something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but there was this strange heaviness in the air, like the building was holding its breath. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting in the lobby when I caught movement on one of the security monitors. It was a grainy feed from the 5th floor. At first, I thought it was a glitch, maybe the camera flickering. But then I saw it again, a figure moving past the window. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. The figure was tall, wearing what looked like a suit. He moved slowly, pacing back and forth in front of the window, like he was waiting for something. My first thought was that maybe someone had stayed late, though I was sure I'd seen everyone leave earlier. Grabbing my flashlight and walkie, I took the elevator up to the 5th floor to check it out. When the doors opened, the air felt colder, almost icy. The floor was completely silent, the rows of cubicles bathed in a dim glow from the emergency exit signs. I walked toward the window where I'd seen the figure, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. There was no one there. I checked every cubicle, every office, every corner. Nothing. Convinced I was imagining things, I turned to head back to the elevator. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like knuckles rapping against glass. I froze, my heart pounding. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Slowly, I turned back toward the window, and there he was. A man in a dark suit stood outside the window, his face pale and featureless, like it had been smudged away. He was impossibly tall, his head nearly brushing the top of the frame. And even though I was on the 5th floor, he was staring straight at me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. The man didn't move, he just stood there, tapping the glass with one long, skeletal finger. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. I rushed back to the elevator, jamming the button repeatedly until the doors finally opened. As I descended, I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that my tired mind was playing tricks on me. But when the elevator reached the lobby, the monitors told a different story. The 5th floor camera was still showing the window, and there, in the corner of the frame, I could see him. The man in the suit, standing perfectly still, watching the elevator doors. I quit the job the next day, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that building. And I wonder if he's still there, pacing the 5th floor, waiting for someone else to notice him. Story: The Vanishing Patient. I used to work as a nurse in a small-town hospital, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Most of my shifts were routine, even during the graveyard hours. But one night, something happened that still haunts me to this day. It was around 2 a.m. when we received a call from EMS about a patient en route. The details were vague. An elderly man found wandering alone along a rural road. He was disoriented and couldn't tell the paramedics his name or where he was from. When the ambulance arrived, I met them in the ER bay. The patient was sitting on the stretcher, a frail old man in a tattered hospital gown. His skin was ashen, his hands trembling slightly. But what struck me most were his eyes, wide and unblinking, filled with a fear that seemed almost unnatural. The paramedics said they'd found him several miles from town, walking barefoot along a deserted stretch of road. He hadn't spoken a word during the ride, just sat there, staring out the window. We brought him into one of the exam rooms and tried to ask him questions. "What's your name? Where do you live? Do you know what happened?" He didn't respond to any of them. He just sat there, staring blankly at the wall. Occasionally, his lips would move, like he was whispering something, but no sound came out. Dr. Keller, our attending physician, ordered some basic tests and asked me to stay with the patient while we waited for the results. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the ER, and I kept getting this strange sensation, like someone was standing behind me. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Then, out of nowhere, the patient grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "Don't let him in," he whispered, his voice raspy and hoarse. I froze. "Don't let who in?" I asked, my heart pounding. But he didn't answer. Instead, he let go of my wrist and leaned back against the bed, his breathing shallow. A few minutes later, Dr. Keller came in with the test results, or rather, the lack of them. The patient's blood work, vitals, and scans all came back completely normal. No signs of dehydration, malnutrition, or injury. There was no medical explanation for his condition. Dr. Keller decided to keep him overnight for observation. We moved him to a room in the West Wing, and I returned to my rounds. About an hour later, I went to check on him, but when I opened the door to his room, it was empty. The bed was neatly made, the IV still hanging untouched. There was no sign of the patient anywhere. I checked with the other nurses, but no one had seen him leave. Security reviewed the cameras, but they didn't show him walking out of the hospital. It was like he'd just vanished. The strangest part came a few days later. I was cleaning out the storage closet in the West Wing when I found something that made my blood run cold. An old patient file, dusty and yellowed with age. It was for a man named Richard Hale, admitted to the hospital in 1967 after being found wandering along a rural road. He was wearing a hospital gown, disoriented, and unable to speak. The file said he disappeared from his room in the middle of the night and was never seen again. The description matched the man I'd seen exactly. I don't know what happened that night, or who or what that patient really was. But sometimes when I'm alone in the ER late at night, I swear I can feel someone watching me. Story: The Last Call. I used to work as a night operator for a small-town 911 dispatch center. The shifts were long, quiet most nights, punctuated only by the occasional call about a minor car accident or a noise complaint. But one night, I received a call that still makes my skin crawl. It was around 3 a.m., the dead hour, when the air feels heavy and the world seems eerily still. I was halfway through my coffee when the phone rang. 911, what's your emergency? I said, my voice steady despite the drowsiness creeping in. There was silence on the other end, just static, faint but persistent. Hello? Can you hear me? I asked again, leaning closer to the console. And then I heard it, a voice, barely a whisper, so faint I had to strain to make it out. He's here. My heart skipped a beat. Who's there? Are you in danger? The line crackled and the voice came through again, trembling and desperate. Please, help me. He's outside. He's watching me. Adrenaline surged through me. I asked for the caller's location, but the line went dead before they could respond. I traced the call and found it was coming from a rural farmhouse about 15 miles outside of town. I radioed the nearest deputy and gave him the address, urging him to check it out. While I waited for an update, I kept replaying the call in my head. The fear in that voice felt too real, too raw, to be a prank. About 20 minutes later, the deputy radioed back. Dispatch, this is Deputy Carson. I'm at the location now. Farmhouse looks abandoned. No signs of anyone here. Are you sure you're at the right address? I asked, confused. Positive. Place is boarded up. Hasn't been lived in for years. I'll take a quick look around, but I think this is a false alarm. I sat there, staring at the screen, my unease growing. A few minutes later, Carson radioed in again. His voice sounded different, lower, almost uncertain. Dispatch, you said the call came from this house, right? That's correct. Why? There was a long pause. I found a phone, he said finally. It's sitting on the kitchen table. The battery's dead and it's covered in dust, but the last call made from it was to 911. I felt a chill run down my spine. Carson, are you saying the phone hasn't been used in years? Looks that way. I'm heading back to my cruiser now. He signed off, but something about his tone made me uneasy. I waited, staring at the clock, expecting him to check in again. Minutes passed, then an hour. I tried calling his radio, but there was no response. When the morning shift arrived, we sent a search team to the farmhouse. They found Carson's cruiser parked on the side of the road, the engine still running. But there was no sign of him. The farmhouse was empty, just like he'd said, and the phone on the table hadn't moved. To this day, no one knows what happened to Deputy Carson. I've told myself it was just a coincidence, that the call I got and his disappearance aren't connected. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that voice on the phone, trembling and afraid, whispering those two words. He's here. Story Room 6B. Here's another unsettling tale titled Room 6B. I worked the night shift as a custodian at a small, aging motel off a quiet highway. It wasn't a fancy place, just 20 rooms, most of them empty during the week. My job was straightforward: clean the lobby, check the vending machines, and occasionally tidy up vacant rooms. Most nights were uneventful. The only sounds were the hum of the ice machine or the distant buzz of cicadas outside. But one night, something happened that I still can't explain. It started around 11 p.m. when the front desk clerk, Rachel, asked me to check on room 6B. The guest, an older man who had checked in earlier that evening, had called down to complain about strange noises coming from the vents. "Probably just the AC acting up again," Rachel said, handing me the key. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the room. The hallway was dimly lit, the kind of place that always felt colder than it should. When I reached room 6B, I knocked lightly. "Maintenance," I called out. "I'm here to check on the noise." There was no response. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. Assuming the guest had stepped out, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was neat, untouched except for an open suitcase on the bed. The air smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke, and the only sound was the faint whir of the AC. I walked over to the vent near the window and knelt down to inspect it. As I unscrewed the cover, I heard something behind me, a faint, shuffling noise. "Hello?" I called out, turning around. The room was empty. Brushing it off as nerves, I went back to work on the vent. That's when I noticed something strange. Inside the vent, wedged into the metal slats, was a small piece of paper. I pulled it out and unfolded it, revealing a single word scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Help." My stomach dropped. I stood up, suddenly hyper-aware of how silent the room had become. The air felt heavy, like the walls were closing in. I decided to check the bathroom, just in case the guest had collapsed or needed assistance. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, the light flickered weakly. The shower curtain was drawn, and for a moment I just stood there, staring at it. Something about the way it hung, too still, too rigid, made my skin crawl. I reached out and yanked the curtain back. The tub was empty. Relieved but still uneasy, I turned to leave. That's when I saw it, a shadow, standing just outside the bathroom door. It was tall, featureless, and impossibly dark, like it was absorbing the faint light from the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat as I stumbled back, fumbling for my flashlight. When I turned it on and shined it toward the door, the shadow was gone. I didn't stick around to investigate. I bolted out of the room and went straight to the front desk, where Rachel looked up, startled by my pale face. "What's wrong?" she asked. "The man in 6B, I stammered. "He's gone. There's something wrong with that room." Rachel's expression darkened. She hesitated for a moment before saying, "There is no guest in 6B. That room hasn't been rented in weeks." I froze. "But I saw his suitcase," I protested. She shook her head. "That room was sealed off after the last guest." Her voice trailed off, and she looked around nervously before continuing in a whisper. "A man died in there. He left a note too. Just one word, help." I quit that job the next morning. But sometimes when I pass by that old motel, I glance toward room 6B. And I swear, just for a moment, I see the faint outline of a shadow in the window, standing perfectly still, waiting for someone to notice. Story: The Midnight Passenger. I used to drive for a rideshare company, mostly night shifts. The city after dark had a strange energy. Empty streets, neon lights reflecting off wet pavement, and the occasional oddball passenger. But there's one ride I'll never forget, one that still gives me chills every time I think about it. It was a quiet Tuesday night, close to 1 a.m. I was about to call it quits when I got a ride request from a location just outside town. It was unusual, an unmarked dirt road leading into the woods. Against my better judgment, I accepted. It was a slow night, and the extra money was tempting. As I approached the location, my headlights cut through the dense trees, illuminating nothing but shadows. Finally, I saw her, a woman standing at the side of the road. She wore a long black dress, and her hair was draped over her face, almost like she didn't want to be seen. I rolled down the window slightly. "Are you the one who requested the ride?" She nodded without saying a word and slid into the back seat. "Where to?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She handed me a piece of paper with an address scrawled on it. It was on the far side of town, near an abandoned industrial park. As we drove, I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the window. Something about her didn't sit right. The way she didn't fidget, the way her breathing was so quiet I couldn't hear it. To break the silence, I asked, "So what brings you out here so late?" She didn't answer. I glanced back, and for a split second, I thought her head had turned just slightly, as if she were looking at me. But when I blinked, she was staring out the window again. The road ahead grew darker as we left the city limits. The trees seemed to close in, and the hum of my tires on the asphalt became the only sound. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the address. It was exactly as eerie as I'd imagined, a crumbling warehouse surrounded by overgrown weeds. "Here we are," I said, my voice tight. She didn't move. "Miss, we're here," I repeated, turning around. The back seat was empty. My heart dropped. I pulled over and got out, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I checked the back seat. Nothing. Not even a sign that anyone had been there. I thought I was losing my mind until I looked at the passenger app on my phone. The ride was still active. I opened the trip details and saw a chilling message in the notes section. "Please help me. I never made it home." I canceled the ride and sped back to the city, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I searched for the address and found an old news article about a young woman who had gone missing 10 years earlier. She was last seen at a party near the woods, wearing a long black dress. Her body was never found. I stopped driving night shifts after that. And that brings us to the end of tonight's chilling tales. Remember, the darkness holds many secrets, and sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that come from the shadows of reality. If you enjoyed these tales, or if you're brave enough to return for more, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Creepy Corner Stories. Your support helps keep the darkness alive, and trust me, there are plenty more nightmares waiting to be shared. Until next time, stay safe and keep the lights on.